Can I have your attention? If you please take your seats. Please take your seats. I have people in the back who are cueing me and keeping an eye on the clock, and it's very, very strict. So I've got to keep this thing moving. We only have an hour, and I promise you that's not going to be enough time to talk to this panel, because it's going to be an amazing discussion, and we'll be able to talk further afterwards. I'm Suzanne Malveaux with CNN. I'm also a Henry Crown Fellow of the year 2011. And this evening is really a great example of collaborative leadership, because what we have are four people who represent something that was amazing that happened in the aftermath of the Charleston massacre. I want to take you back to that day and just describe it very briefly. We'll also see a video, and then we'll start our discussion. It was June 15th. It was Charleston, South Carolina, at Emanuel AME Church. A young man went into that church during a Bible study, sat with a small group of parishioners, prayed with them, and then opened fire, killing 9 African Americans, including the pastor and state senator, Clementa Pinckney. This cowardly act of hate and racism would galvanize a community as well as a nation, and also serve as a catalyst for taking down the Confederate flag, a symbol of Southern heritage for some, but for many others, one that symbolized hate and oppression of African Americans from the period of slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation. A group of Liberty Fellows from South Carolina galvanized in grief to take action to try to lead and transform their community, one of hurt into healing, and also to deal with this critical issue of the Confederate flag. So let's watch a brief video.
21-year-old Dylan Roth is in custody, caught in North Carolina, armed with a gun.
That terrible human being who would go into a place of worship and people were praying and kill them is now in custody.
It's not known if the gun found is the murder weapon, but Roth is suspected of killing 9 people inside the historic Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, founded in 1816.
We woke up today and the heart and soul of South Carolina was broken.
Just after 8 p.m. Wednesday night, Roth entered the church. He was invited to join a Bible study group. Witnesses told police that around 9 p.m., Roth stood up and said that he was there to shoot black people. He allegedly then took out his handgun and opened fire, killing 9.
I'd like to introduce our panel. Joining us first, next to me, this is South Carolina State Senator Vincent Shaheen. He's the legislator, the politician of the group. He served as Democratic senator for a decade and sponsored the legislation to bring down the Confederate flag. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mickey Johnson, we're going to refer to you as the businessman. You said you prefer the lumberman, because he is CEO of Cox Industries. It's a private business specializing in manufacturing, distributing pressure-treated wood. He's also on the Chamber of Commerce. He has ties to groups like Habitat for Humanity and March of Dimes. So, Mickey, welcome. Mikey, as in the cereal. Thank you for the correction, Mikey.
I've never heard that one.
Not an original, sorry. Michelle Mapp, Executive Director of Low Country Housing Trust. She partners with financial institutions to provide people with affordable housing, and she is the key to the nonprofit community, really served as the bridge from the nonprofit to the business community in terms of making a difference. Thank you, Michelle. And last, John Simpkins. He is Deputy General Counsel, White House Office of Management and Budget, previously a law professor and constitutional law expert, He also hops back and forth from Vancouver, British Columbia, as well as Washington, D.C. And we call him the White House connection, but also the kind of the underground message man. Welcome, John Simpkins. So, Senator, I'd like to start with you, and I'd like to ask each of the panelists this question, and then we'll also move into more of the roles that you played. But I want you to just take us back to that moment when we found out that there was that shooting inside the church, and what that meant for you personally when you heard the news.
Well, you have to understand that South Carolina is a fairly small place, so we all tend to know each other. And I served with Senator Pinckney, who was the pastor of Emanuel, and served with him for about 11 years. He was my seatmate in the Senate. And we were actually together that day and had lunch with a small group, probably about noon, and then went into session briefly. And then Clem had to leave early because he had to go to church. So I found out that night about 9:30 when my wife woke me. I go to bed early. When my wife woke me up because my fellow senators were calling my house. And it was a very awful feeling. We did not know exactly what was going on, but you know, when we called Clem or texted him, there was no response. So it didn't look very hopeful. Knew for sure about midnight. What can you do? You know, we woke up that next morning, got a little bit of sleep, and went to the Senate. And we got together, a few of the leadership, we got together and said, how do we handle this? I called the clerk and asked him to make sure there was a wreath on Senator Pinckney's desk. He told me that he'd already placed a black cloth across the desk. And we got together and we decided the best way we can handle it would not go into session or walk away or give this murderer any more feeling of empowerment than he had, but to go into session and talk about the life of Clem Pinckney, and that's what we did. And I'll talk a little bit more about Clem. He was a really great, gentle, kind, just good soul, and is very much missed. And
you know him very well.
Yes, I had the privilege of sitting next to him for this year and sitting near him for about 11 years. And over the last few years, got closer to Clem. He was a private person, so I didn't go to his house, he didn't go to my house, but I ran for governor the previous year, and Clem was an ardent supporter, and he would meet me, and he was an African Methodist Episcopal preacher. My wife Amy and I had been to his previous church and worshiped with him some years ago in Beaufort, a little church, wonderful place. I'd been in Mother Emanuel with him. But he would go and meet me in these churches, and he would vouch for me, and he would, if I was maybe speaking to a group, he would talk about the need to change South Carolina. I've said it before because it meant so much to me. He would say, "This is my brother, Vincent Shaheen." He was a really good man, and he's sorely missed in South Carolina. And it's frankly hard to believe that when I walk into the Senate chamber and I look next to my seat, that he's not there.
Mikey.
So I was actually out of the country when the event happened, so information was slow rolling to me. I was up in Canada and in fact on kind of off the coast, and just hearing the information come through. I was with a group from actually spread across the southeast and from Texas to the Gulf Coast, and on, of course, our group from South Carolina. And I also had my 16-year-old son, and when a tragedy hits, you kind of look, and I was watching my son to see what his response would be. And of course, at this point, we didn't realize there was going to be, the photo that would follow shortly after with the Confederate flag and those type of issues. So we just knew that a tragedy had happened in South Carolina. Then, of course, the information came out that, of course, Senator Pinckney was killed, and he was just as, while I did not know him well, his reputation was second to none, present company excluded. And so we, as we were just dealing with that, I remember our conversation that night at dinner with that group I was with. What would be the implications in South Carolina, knowing that we'd had some events going on around the country whether it was Baltimore or wherever Ferguson or whatever you had heard. We didn't really talk about those things happening, but people, it was natural to hearken back and think that those things were a possibility. So we didn't talk about them happening, but those came up in our conversation. So as we were coming home, the thought process was, what does this mean? And I live about an hour from Charleston, and so it's fairly close to home. I didn't know any of the 9 people that were killed, but clearly, 9 families, and I do know our governor, of course, very well, and to see her emotion, that was real raw emotion. And
You guys went to high school together, right?
We did.
You and the
We
governor.
did. Sure did. So getting back, it was just trying to figure out what was going to happen next, and we'll talk a little bit about Vincent was one of the first people to reach out to me at that point.
All right, Michelle.
So I live in Charleston. Grew up in the AME church in Charleston. I was actually in bed that night when we got a call from my husband's grandmother in Atlanta, who was watching the news and wanted to make sure that we were okay, because she knew that many Wednesday nights we are also at church. The next morning, the texts started to come. I was actually driving to Georgetown, South Carolina, when my best friend texted me and said, "Did you hear about Sharonda?" And then slowly, as the day went through, I would get a text that said, "Did you hear about so-and-so's grandmother?" The paying doctor was a colleague I knew from work. Tywanza Sanders was my husband's co-worker's son. Susie Shannon was another friend's grandmother. And the list kind of goes on and on. And so it was very personal and very real to me.
Thank you, Michelle. John?
So, like Michelle, this didn't hit close to home, it hit home in ways that it was a strange intersection of all of these different parts of my life. I've known Clem Pinkney since we were in high school, when we were both YPDers, which is the Young People's Division in the AME Church, and we would spend Saturdays against our will giving speeches and doing all these other things that were meant to bring us into the leadership of the AME Church. My uncles and other relatives have been pastors in the AME Church. Emanuel is our church home away from home when we're in Charleston. I grew up outside of Columbia. And Daniel Simmons was a relative of mine and went to school with my mother. So this was very close to home. The killer is from my hometown. The flags that he was wearing were the flags of a place that mean a great deal to me. And I was in South Africa when that flag came down. So to have all of this converge in a way that was so violent and horrific, and then not to be there, made me think of ways that I could, in some way, be involved in the solution to this.
So it's all clear that you were all very much invested in the community. You found out about this, and it hit you in different ways, and for some of you in a very personal way. Vincent, I want you to start off and talk about immediately what did you start to do? How did you start to mobilize, and how did you see your role in this as someone who brought the legislation forward?
Right. Well, I think it's important to step back and say, in the immediate aftermath of this massacre, what was the appropriate thing to do? And I felt very strongly as someone who knew Clem and knew that these victims were people who worshiped with Clem and I knew had the same character that Clem did. It was important that we take some time to honor them and dwell on them and the loss. I just think that's so important. I think that's part of what makes us human. And I thought that it was important we did that. And we did that in the Senate. There were memorials that day all across the state for the victims. Many of us went and participated, and I can't tell you how important I think that is. I think we saw that reflected in many of the victims' families, and I want to make that point because we sometimes think, well, naturally what came next was political action, but it's not naturally what came next. What comes after something like this is mourning, and many people are still mourning. But not long after that, you realize is anything going to happen? Is there going to be any meaning from this senselessness? And there was a real debate in the political circles that day whether we should push. We knew this was a racist killing. We knew that these 9 people were killed because they were black. We live in South Carolina. There is a tremendously long history of racial division. It is still very real. It still exists. It's still palpable. It's not an accident this occurred in South Carolina. So the question was, is there anything that we can do? I had been a proponent for taking down the Confederate flag from the front of the State House steps for a number of years. It was not a very popular issue, frankly. I represent a fairly rural and Caucasian district. The Confederate flag flies in front of houses in my district in some places. But I had, in the last governor's campaign, advocated very publicly and purposely made it a position of the campaign that we should take down the Confederate flag. My opponent supported keeping it up. I want everybody to understand part of the reason that I publicly made this an issue was because of people like Mikey and private conversations that we had, because I think that reflects on all the fellows in this room, the impact that you can have over the course of years. So I knew that, to me, that it was important that we use this moment for any good that could come out of it.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And there were others as well. It wasn't just me. There was a core group, and we, that day, that Thursday afternoon and Friday, began to hatch a very specific strategy to lower the Confederate battle flag, and it focused on 2 things. Number 1 was ramping up public pressure on our elected officials so that they had no choice but to support taking down the flag. And we did that by making media appearances very quickly, supporting rallies in our state. And a lot of this was organic from the people of South Carolina, and that is something I think that was a good outcome. And the second thing was to be very specific that we weren't here to cut deals or make agreements about this was about lowering the Confederate battle flag and putting it in a museum where it would be a part of history and explained. We followed that strategy through for the next 3 weeks through a variety of tactics that were successful, but it was very difficult to do that in the aftermath of this, because really those of us who knew these people, and we all knew them, we didn't want to go do interviews and go to rallies. We wanted to shut the door and cry.
So, Mikey, you did something that was really kind of incredible. It was behind the scenes. I talked to the Liberty Fellows, and they say, you were the guy who people were talking about. Are you on Mikey's email chain? Are you on his chain? And you told me yourself that you went from 12 Liberty Fellows to 80 Liberty Fellows who were involved in this movement within 4 days. Describe what it was that you were doing.
Yeah, so maybe just like Vincent, taking a step back, Vincent and I, and through our very gracious benefactors of the Liberty Fellowship, Hayne and Anna Kate Hipp, they never like to be mentioned, but this conversation started with Vincent and I over 2 years ago around a dinner table. And I remember we had a long debate about whether the time was right to deal with the flag. And there was about half the people at that table said, we can get it down now. And there was the other half that said, and rightfully probably so, what we saw in the aftermath, particularly with what we had to go through, is that legislatively it wasn't the right time. And that is probably what we lost on a lot of people, because the vote seemed so overwhelming, and it did come to happen. But the conversation happened, and so it wasn't Mikey's email chain. It was Vincent sent me an email and said, we talk a lot, we don't act enough. And so at a previous Liberty event, I was sitting in the front row, and we were challenged with issues that mattered to our state. And so I raised my hand and said the flag. There were probably 200 people behind me that would have raised their hand and said the flag. And I remember, afterwards there was a little group of us that huddled around, Vincent included, and so the conversation was already started. In fact, just a couple months ago, we had a conversation about alternate plans to move a flag that is in my hometown. And in fact, it ended up being one of the amendments we ended up fighting, or the legislators ended up fighting through the process. So it started a long time ago, but once I put the email out, I think the initial group was about a dozen, and that committee had already been formed. So from an action perspective, all of us we might not be ready for this random act, but we can be in position when it happens to have a group that can come together. So I think back on, had we not been in that place, who would have filled that void. I don't know what group that would have been. I've thought about it, and I can't think who that would have been. But so we quickly came together, the email chain, which was really guidance for how to get involved, what we were doing, where we thought we could be, where we thought we didn't need to be, where we thought we could create more harm than good in terms of the effort. The General Assembly had a very good plan. I mean, if you saw what came out of the Senate, it was a 37-3 vote that moved it over to the House. So Vincent and his team had it ready, and we have a host of Liberty Fellows that serve in the General Assembly that were really in lockstep on how this was going to be by and large.
So they were making calls and pushing people and that kind of thing.
Right. So then it became is how do you motivate the business community, the nonprofit community, and then of course reach out to those members of the General Assembly that we don't know. I mean, there were members of the General Assembly we reached out and called for the first time, and quite frankly, I was stunned at some of the things I heard. I was surprised. I really didn't believe it till I really heard it. And not that it was this, I don't want to sell any story that we have these vehement racists and that, can't stand this idea. They were just very caught up in this idea that this flag represented a heritage, that represented the veterans, the Confederate dead. And so I don't want to take away from any of those General Assembly members who had a different opinion. It was just their opinion. But it was good that we were in a position to be able to ascertain what that movement looked like, to find out what their counter-arguments were going to be, and be ready for them. So Vincent and the other legislators, Shane's here, and there are others that were quickly ready to be able to deal with, even if something did come up. We were in position to take action. So we had plan on top of plan on top of plan. And I say we. I mean, really, these guys in the General Assembly, guys, males and females, really made it happen. And but to have that support network, one of our fellows reached out to the entire business community kind of via the Chamber of Commerce and the Manufacturers Alliance. And we ran ads in papers showing a broad-based business support system. And I think that was very well received and probably gave those members of the General Assembly that were in difficult districts that sat on the bubble of which way they were going to go, hopefully some encouragement to go to the side we wanted them to move. So.
And Michelle, talk about your role, because you told me that you actually, there was about, 1,700 folks in the nonprofit community that were going to have a happy hour, and that happy hour turned into something else, and you took it from there.
Sure. So we had already had planned to have what we call a nonprofit low country gathering. And it was scheduled for the Tuesday following the shootings. And so a couple of Liberty Fellows got on a call together to talk about should we move forward with the nonprofit gathering. And we said yes, we definitely felt we should, but that we should change the tone of the event, that it shouldn't be a happy hour and we shouldn't be drinking. And so we did a candle lighting for each of the victims. And then we had an open discussion and dialogue among the nonprofits in Charleston about this ideology of hate and where do we go from here, and how the work that we all individually were doing as nonprofits, would it be different? And I think it's important to note that the Thursday right after the shooting, there was a church service. And quite frankly, I was afraid to go. They had not caught the killer yet. And a fellow was actually in Dallas, Texas, and was sort of reaching out to me. And I had said I was afraid to go to the service, and he said, we can't let fear win. And I went to the service, and Congressman Clyburn quoted a letter from a Birmingham jail and said, now is not the time for the good people to be silent.
Right.
That's right.
And I think that really was a rallying cry for a lot of us, and I think very quickly realized that it was going to be a grassroots effort, and that a lot of people started to make statements. And I think the power of social media to sort of coalesce a lot of people around this issue was powerful.
And Michelle, you also told me about how you really took it upon yourself, because you have a broad coalition, white, black, many different types of people in the business community, the nonprofit world, of what this flag meant, right? The historical context, and the church as well. Can you describe a little bit about how it is that you needed to communicate to people who just didn't get it, they didn't understand?
Sure. So the sort of political dialogue right after was very much that he was mentally ill, and in my opinion, made it seem like it was a very random act. And I think that it was important to share with people who didn't know about the history of the church, about this particular church and the role that it played in the African American community, and the significance of the fact that he had gone into the church, this particular church, that's called Mother Emanuel, which is the mother of the AME church, that has this history very steeped in a slave revolt, and had done this act. And so to help people understand that it wasn't just this sort of random act, but that it was calculated, and that it was, for us in the African American community in Charleston, an act of terrorism, because we were terrified. My children were terrified, and we didn't know what was happening. And so I think just articulating for people, we don't have these conversations. We don't talk about race a lot.
We're not comfortable with that, yeah.
And people are uncomfortable, and I think that it was important for me to help people understand that I didn't see the flag as heritage, that, when I see the history books, when I see a lynching, or when I see, the manifesto, and I see this flag flying in the background, that it had a very different meaning to me.
Sure.
And that if we were going to be united as one, and we were having this very public demonstration of unity, that it needed to be real.
And John, you were somebody who couldn't really publicly come out and tell people what it was that you were doing because of your position, but you played a significant role in the messaging. You told me about the businesses and the language that would make it comfortable for some of these businesses to sign on to getting the flag down, and what that would take, and using your personal connections. Can you talk about the role that you played?
Just as a basic matter, I think everyone has to understand that nothing was going to happen with the flag until white people in South Carolina decided that the flag was going to come down. Black people have been arguing to get the thing down for decades, since it went up.
And I think it's important to note it went up in 1961.
Right.
During the Civil Rights era.
During the Civil Rights era, as the schools were about to be desegregated, my schools in Lexington weren't desegregated until 1974, which was the year before I started school. So there was that history, and there was a need to, as Michelle said, recognize what we were talking about when we'd say Southern heritage, and to really build for a more expansive notion of what Southern heritage was going to be. Looking at the aftermath of how Charleston came together and really demonstrated to the world, and literally the world. I run by the museum in the morning, and they have front pages of newspapers from all over the world and the US. And every paper the day after the shooting had Charleston above the fold on the headline. And so Charleston became like Ferguson, it became like Newtown, it became like Columbine, in a way that you'd never want it to be. So the challenge then was to harness the energy to change that narrative.
So you were out of the country. What did you do? You heard about it, and then what was some of the tangibles that when you stepped in?
We got the business community to agree to a statement that the flag should come down, not that there should be some solution that was short of that the flag should come down. And the reason why the flag should come down would be to begin this process of healing South Carolina. Let's be very clear. Bringing the flag down is not the end. That's removal of a symbol. So strategically thinking about the next steps, we need to begin the process of healing the state, and that's bringing people together, not trying to polarize the different groups.
And if I could just jump in on a couple points that were brought up here, I think they're important. Healing the state, I think sometimes we think, well, healing the state from what happened in June, but it's really healing the state from a division that's existed since its inception, and that's a long process. And I think Michelle brought up, the difference in the way people look at this symbol, and I think that's really important to think about. And John did a great job in framing that. And on the political side, we very consciously tried to frame this discussion not as, does the Confederate flag stand for heritage and history and honoring your ancestors, or does it stand for hate and oppression? Because you know what? There's no way I'm going to convince some fifth-generation descendant that their ancestor fought on the right or wrong side. You can't win those arguments. So we really framed it as, where are we going? This symbol divides us. Can we afford to move forward divided, or do we need to come together? And that was the message, so that we didn't devolve into a debate about hate or heritage or whose side of history is right, because we had a very clear mission, and it was to move forward. And you only move forward if you're moving forward united.
Can I be cynical for a moment here? Is it possible that, I mean, in the messaging, in what the pressure that you were putting on these businesses, that it really was about, look, take the flag down, this is good for business. If you keep the flag up, it's bad for business. So we want to keep the state, we want to keep the economy, we want to keep things running and going in that way, in that manner.
There are lots of things that are good for business.
Right.
Education's good for business. Having people have access to homes that are affordable, that they can keep, is good for business. So that's the beginning of the discussion. If this is good for business, there are lots of other things that are good for business, and we can get the business community behind that. But I think it's much broader even than just trying to appease businesses as they're coming in or doing business in the state.
To your point, I think it speaks terribly on our state, business sector, political sector, that it took a massacre of 9 innocent people for us to do what we should have done. That is not something we should be proud of. Perhaps we should be proud that after such a terrible event, we were able to come together and accomplish something. But we should not sugarcoat it and be proud of the fact that it took this event to achieve something that needed to be done for healing and forward motion.
That's a trade-off no one would have taken if you'd been presented with that in the first place.
But I'll add, when we first put out our feelers, so now mind you, the network of Liberty Fellows that reached out to businesses were clearly reaching out to the businesses that they knew and did business with and collaborated with. So when we reached out, our initial push, I think in about a matter of 24 hours, in fact, I remember when one of the fellows put out an email and said, if we want to run this ad, and we ran it in basically every major newspaper in South Carolina, it's a full-page ad with all the businesses. I mean, we had less than 24 hours and to make the deadline, and we had about 110 businesses. So that was probably about everyone that fellows actually reached out to. And then what we started to see was, those that didn't make that first one came back and said, I didn't know that was going out. I wanted to be a part. So I think, the seminal moment of the tragedy definitely sparked a lot of people to move. What I think was sad was there was so much energy that was ready to make it happen, and unfortunately it took an event like this to light the fuse. But there was a lot of energy, and you saw it with the passion in both houses of our General Assembly. You saw how fast the business community organized, the nonprofit community organized, and I still think, while not a quiet minority, the group that wanted that flag to stay up went to great efforts to be very loud, to delay, to present alternates, and that the fact that we were organized and there was enough momentum, because we see the votes. If you followed the story, the final vote out of the House was, I think, 93-27. But unless you happen to go back and look in the record, was there 61 amendments? You were there that night for the House?
Very narrow votes, and in the Senate there was 2 narrow votes too.
Yeah. I mean, what you didn't see is in the heat of those moments, and this was going on, I was actually sitting outside my canvas wall tent at Boy Scout summer camp as this was going down on my phone with my pill, and it actually was pretty amazing. I had basically 20 scouts sitting around me. It's 11 o'clock at night. I said, y'all got to go to bed. And they said, well, you got to turn the speaker up. They're sleeping in Adirondacks. And they said, why are we having this argument? Of course, it went on. The final vote was cast at, I think, 1:11 a.m. in the morning. And then, of course, the next day the governor signed the bill, and then the next day the flag came down. But what you didn't hear, unless you were watching or listening, were the 62 to 58 votes that narrowly tabled amendments that, had the right people not been in the right places, the General Assembly, the advocates, the businesses, the nonprofits, had the messaging not been right, that today there's probably another flag up there flying. The South Carolina probably flew 100. Confederate flags during the Civil War. So there were a lot of very sound in the minds of those presenting them arguments to fly a different flag or to wait and tackle this in January when the General Assembly reconvened. And to be that we were there to intercept that was no small feat, right? All the pieces had to come together. And the beauty of this group is there was no aggrandizement of who was going to be the hero and where that was going to come from. It was this unified effort. Nobody was trying to headline. Nobody was running to the media any more than we felt like we need. There weren't a lot of kudos when something went well. We were trying to keep that tempered. We weren't trying to spike the ball when things were going our way in the heat of the moment. And that's what made it happen. But this was an effort beyond, I think our fellowship our fellows that were active. And there were 84, I think, on the last check on the email. But probably 220 would have been on it. We didn't make a cattle call to say, jump on this email. It just organically grew, and that was the exciting piece, to know that we were going to be in position and to know that we had the backs. I think hopefully for these guys to know that we had their backs and we were ready to be there when they were going to go out. Because it's not over, right?
Right.
I mean, there's still more, and there's still members of the General Assembly who took big steps who will face competition as a result of their position.
One more question, then we're going to open it up to the audience. But do you think, two things here. Do you think that the flag would have come down if it hadn't been for the Liberty Fellows, the collaborative effort, the leadership effort of that group, your group? And secondly, do you think, does it take a tragedy to act as a catalyst for social change? I mean, you had everything in place for a long, long time, and then this happened and it moved you. Does it have to be something of that nature to spawn action? Anyone?
I think it's important that the victim that most people were aware of was a member of the legislature. That this was someone who the legislators knew, and that was no small fact in my mind. It certainly would have taken a crisis of some kind, whether it was this or something else, and I think that certainly was a catalyst for moving this along.
But I hope something that we all take away as fellows and participants is that it shouldn't take a crisis to move things forward. We should push hard for change. Sometimes we'll fail, sometimes we'll be successful, but we do build on what we've done in the past to achieve that success ultimately. I'm sad to say I think that John's right. In South Carolina, at least at this present time, it took some type of crisis for that to occur. Whether it would have come down without the participation in the Liberty Fellowship, who knows? I would like to think it would, but I also believe that the Liberty Fellowship played a very valuable and important role in helping to motivate, coordinate, and participate in making it happen. There was 1,000 moving pieces, but it was important that each piece contribute as best they could, and this was an important piece.
All right, let's open it up for questions in the audience. Yes, ma'am. Do we have microphones?
So thank you, everyone. I actually just want to make a couple comments. One is, as a South Carolinian, I couldn't be more proud of Charleston and of the family and of their response, because we weren't Ferguson and because we weren't Baltimore. And I just don't want them to be forgotten, and how they reached out with forgiveness. And that is like a heart that if all of us could tap into is an intense amount of power. And then as far as leadership is concerned, already today, there's been talk about, am I reaching far enough? And as great as my friends are on stage, there was another Liberty Fellow that's not here today, but was in the House. And Jenny Horn, a Jefferson Davis descendant, gave an incredible speech that night that I just think, thank God she was there. Thank God she was in that place at that moment to be able to give that speech. And I think for everyone in this room, like, however small your leadership may feel at that moment, you might be in that right space, just waiting for that opportunity. And that was really powerful to me. And the last thing I guess I would say, as someone who's a transplant to South Carolina, most of this room is probably like, why the heck did it take so long? And I feel like maybe one of you could discuss that it wasn't that easy of a vote, that something had happened a few years back where we moved the flag from the top to the front, and we required, I think, a 2/3 majority. So there was, in a sense, bad leadership that perhaps led to a need for incredible leadership. And I wonder if the whole room gets that problem, and I think we could all learn from that.
Can I respond?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think it's very important that there's a danger when we say that we weren't Baltimore and we weren't Ferguson. Because the very real difference is that in this country, we've resorted to blaming victims when they die. And so what happened in Charleston is that we had 9 people who were in church. And so it was easy for people to come together and hold hands and say that this shouldn't have happened. The danger is that in places like Baltimore and in Ferguson, when it's not cut and dry and when the victim is not squeaky clean, it seems in this country, unless black folks get upset, there is no attention to it. And so I think that it's very, I think we have to be careful about kind of holding ourselves up as an example, because the problems that exist in Baltimore and the problems that exist in Ferguson very much exist in Charleston. I live in North Charleston, where Walter Scott was shot and killed 5 times while running away. And so these problems do exist. Maybe as a community, our response has been different. And I think we can unpack and have a whole another conversation about why. But I think it's just very important for us to not think that we're in any way better than those communities.
Thank you.
I might add this with you, and I think, B, to your point, what those 9 families did, though, hopefully sets a tone for other families, and what can't be lost. If they said it once in both the Senate and the House, I heard them talk about grace and the importance of their faith and how that community responded. I mean, the heroes of this whole story were those 9 families who got up and said, "We forgive," and that's who we are.
Somebody from this side? Is there a microphone? Go ahead. Or microphones?
Just yell.
Just yell it. Yeah.
So, Brady Hilliard from Henry Crown Fellowship. I'm from North Carolina. I know how I feel about this, but my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, cousins, were all from South Carolina. So I have a lot of family there outside of Columbia, Irma.
All right.
And unfortunately, I know how they feel about this. So, Mikey, for you, when you made those first calls and you got support from the first round, then you made the second calls and you got resistance. What they said to you in response, how did that make you feel? You know, as a South Carolinian, as a person, what did you feel about their different opinion, and how did you respond to them?
Yeah. So the first piece is, I'll say, I was there were a couple people that so we were all making calls to various members of the General Assembly, and there were a couple that I talked to, and I'll say it was literally shock. And I think Vincent, 18 months ago at the dinner table, had basically told me what I was going to hear, and I just think I was shocked to hear it. I just didn't expect it for somebody to be able to get on the other end of the phone and say the things they said out loud. Not, here again, they weren't vitriol, it was just passion for this particular issue, and that despite all this, they couldn't see through it. And so I guess for that piece, I was shocked and stunned. I've told some people earlier today, I don't know that I was surprised with how Charleston responded. I don't know if that's the word I would use. I mean, I think we live in a state that is led largely by faith. We have a tremendous faith-based community, And when they came out and took the steps like I just mentioned a minute ago, I mean, that's the part of South Carolina that I see and I feel, and even my community. I mean, in the very community I live, Orangeburg, South Carolina, was the home of a place of the Orangeburg massacre, which was a civil rights event of unfortunate notoriety for our little community. And it's taken us a long time. Probably the largest Confederate flag still flying in South Carolina flies in front of a barbecue joint in Orangeburg, South Carolina. So we still have a long road to go. I pass that flag every day I go home. It's between 4 miles between my house. In fact, a couple weeks ago, we passed around an email on how to get them, ironically, to fly an alternate flag, just to get them in the habit of flying a different flag, which is one of the very things we ended up fighting over and over and over again in the House and the Senate of those amendments. But so yeah, it's a combination, and of course, being a North Carolina guy not far away, you certainly sense that there was the shock, surprise, sadness, but at the same time, joy that our state did respond the way they did, and I couldn't be prouder and wouldn't live anywhere else.
You know, if I could respond to that briefly as well, I very publicly came out prior to these shootings with a position that said we should take down the flag. And I really got responses that were two different ways that were against it. Some were just flat out hate. Vincent Shaheen, your political career is over. Physical threats, and this happened again after the shootings. Again, emails that said terrible things, awful things. Just hate, and there's a lot of hate out there. We should never underestimate how much hate there is. There is. But then the other responses I would get were people who genuinely couldn't understand why I said that, why I believed that it was time to retire the Confederate flag. I mean, genuinely could not understand. And I arrived at the conclusion that they just could not see through someone else's eyes. They couldn't see how Michelle saw this flag. Because if they could, there's no way that they would call me up and tell me that. There are a lot of people like that who believe that the flag should continue to fly because it represented the values that they thought that they attributed to the Confederacy, that they thought were important, that they thought were part of our historical value. But if they could have looked through somebody else's eyes, I don't think they would have said that. And that's really my goal, is to try to bridge that divide.
Another question back there? There's a microphone right near this woman. Oh, okay, sure.
First, thank you very much, and I just want to appreciate the Action Forum for the opportunity to even have this conversation. What I think I want to say, my mom and my family comes from Charleston, and I grew up in New York, and so I'm really accustomed to talking about race, and I don't know how not to talk about race, but the thing that I would love for you guys to respond to is, if the taking down of the flag was the beginning of a process to heal, and if we feel like after chattel slavery and Jim Crow and all of that, the forgiveness of black people once again is what we need to move forward, then what is it that white America brings to this? Like, what do we bring? Like, we've got a whole national narrative around Black Lives Matters because it's 1956 again. We're burning churches, we're killing black people at an alarming rate. And so I can go into my faith and I can be forgiving, but that's not really gotten me where I feel like I need to be in this nation. And what are we prepared to do? Like, is the expectation in white America that we'll be forever forgiving and we're going to have the right dialogue and we're going to make everybody feel comfortable? And while I get that that's necessary in a political process, where is equality in schools and economic opportunity? And when are we going to have an honest conversation about the growing divide around wealth and the opportunity gap in general? And do we really believe that white America can be successful without an entire section of the nation, which is Black America? And so I'd love for you guys to talk about, like, how do we get uncomfortable in this conversation? And in particular, I want to thank you, Michelle, for saying, like, we're not different. All of us are angry. You didn't say that, but all of us, I'll say it. All of us are angry.
Wow. Michelle, you want to start?
I'm happy to. Well, thank you for that question and your comments, first of all. I think what you just talked about is why I don't like the forgiveness narrative discussion, and I haven't really engaged in it very much. While I respect and am thankful for what those families did, and at this point, one of my heroes is Clem's wife, Jennifer, who is just, I can't even imagine, and the way she has conducted herself and been such a rock has given me hope. But in the political dynamic, I really don't like discussing the forgiveness narrative because I don't think, as you said it much better than I. And I don't want to think, but I do think that probably white guilt after what happened played a role in this flag coming down. And that's not a very pleasant thing to think about either, that it came down because some people felt guilty. When the original, it's also why I didn't like this original discussion about, well, this crazy man went in and shot up the church. Because this happened in South Carolina for a reason. And there haven't been a lot of crazy black people that walk in white churches and shoot them up. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. So these things are occurring for a reason. If we don't grapple with it for real, and if everybody, including white America and white South Carolina, doesn't grapple with it for real, then we're not going to make much progress. So I think the questions need to be asked need to be very pointed, and you're asking some of them, and I would add to them, and I'm asking them as well. Why do we in South Carolina draw districts for representation based on race? Why do we pack black people in black districts and white people in white districts so you don't have to vote for somebody who doesn't look like you? That is a terrible thing to do, but that's what we're doing, and we do it in many parts of America. Why do we not invest in schools in rural black districts like we do in white urban districts? That's a terrible thing to do and expect to have a good result. And for those of you who don't live in states that have this diversity that we have, which I think is why I love South Carolina, to celebrate the diversity that we have. You might not understand it, but it is very real. It's a very real divide. I think we have to ask those pointed questions, and I don't think white people should just say that black people are going to be the ones who ask them and have to push them forward. I think it's incumbent on all of us to do it. And I can't say I'm doing it perfectly or well, but I can say I'm giving it my best.
Yeah, and I might just add, so, if you think about where we were this morning and what we were talking about or this afternoon, that's not what I want to be known as. A friend, one of my Liberty Fellows in one of the classes this morning said, that's not who I want to be represented by. That's not what I want to be like. So those of us that are willing to take steps just have to be willing to do it and be passionate about it and be willing to sit up here and, like Vince is doing and, put your, political self out there or put your business self out there. And, there's no good answer for how we're going to change all of white America. It's certainly going to, we're a long way from there, but we got to start having the conversations. And I think it started with what you saw happen on July 10th. I think we've reinvigorated the conversation in our state. And, but I love your question. I appreciate your passion. And when you're ready to come back, we'll be glad to have you host.
We need you. We need you there. Absolutely, we need
Mike,
you there.
I want to ask you just a quick follow-up with that. You said you had all those conversations with folks, and you said you were shocked, very disturbed by what they said to you. You were surprised. Are you motivated to go back to some of those people who you talked to and heard those ugly things from and say, hey, look, this isn't the way to do it. This isn't right. Is that something that you think you would be a part of the next steps?
Yeah, so, well, I guess there's this balance between spiking the football and saying you've got something done. But I do think that one of the things we talked about when we first heard we were going to, we knew we needed 2/3. We knew that's what it would take to have the flag down. There was some debate on the legality if we actually needed 2/3, but that's the way it was going to play out. But when we had our first call, so right after our first email chain went around, we had a call. And we weren't shooting for 2/3. We were shooting for everybody. And we wanted everybody to vote this way. So we taught everybody. And we wanted it to be a lonely place when you voted no to take the flag down. We wanted the 27 people that voted no to be on an island. And so my hopes are there are consequences for that. And we'll take that up when it comes time for elections and who we choose to represent us in South Carolina. So that'll come next.
John, did you want to weigh in? You haven't,
Yeah,
you haven't heard from
after your question, I was inclined to jump in with an answer, but given your question, I thought it was important for the white guys to answer. And,
I felt that. I felt it coming from John.
they need to do that. They need to answer for themselves, and they need to continue to ask those questions of themselves. I think one of the greatest values of the Liberty Fellowship and the Aspen Global Leadership Network is that it gets people in the same room where they can engage and understand that there are human consequences to the decisions or lack of decisions that they make. You know, Charleston is like the Ellis Island of African America. The largest number of Africans came into the United States off the coast of Charleston than anywhere else in the United States. There are certainly, as you see here on the stage, there are white people of goodwill who want to see things change and who take great risks to see things change. The mayor of Charleston, who was on that video, whose son's sitting out here in the audience, was called Black Joe because when he was in the legislature, he insisted on sitting next to one of the African-American members of the legislature. We have the core of people of goodwill who want to change things in that state. I think what we need to do is to make sure that we're all walking in the same direction so that it's not just people feeling good about each other, but it's addressing the underlying causes that dehumanize others and make it okay to engage in the kind of activity that we see all across the country.
We have 1 minute left, and I'd like to give the last word to Michelle. If you would wrap it for us and give us a sense of what you think is important coming out of this session.
So I think two things. I think one is white America needs to have a conversation. But I also think that, and that's the power of this room, is in relationship. And I shared with some people earlier today that I went to Starbucks this morning and had coffee and sat there for an hour. And that in that hour, I was the only black person at the Starbucks. And I thought to myself, in a world, if I live in a world where I never see or interact with someone who's different from me, why would I ever be able to dispel the stereotypes and generalizations of the other? And so I think that we need to continue to have conversations, but I also think we need to figure out how we have real relationships with people who are different from us so that then we can see things through one another's eyes and understand that ultimately we all are the same.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome.